Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the manager of academic programs and outreach at JDC Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar in the context of the Nathan and Sarah Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship. I'd like to start by saying a few words about JDC Archives. JDC Archives holds the records of the Joint Distribution Committee since its creation about 106 years ago. As such, it is one of the most important repositories for the study of modern Jewish history. Scholars from around the world, as well as filmmakers, journalists, family researchers, use our collections for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in our archives. One of these fellowships is the Nathan and Sarah Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship, which was established in 2019 thanks to a generous gift from Dr. Sorrel Chassin and Lauren Chassin to honor Dr. Sorrel Chassin's grandparents. Sorrel and Lauren Chassin are supporters of JDC with deep roots in the field of higher education and a long-term commitment to academic research and scholarship. I would like to extend our thanks to Dr. Sorrel Chassin and Lauren Chassin, who are with us today, for their generosity in endowing this fellowship, as well as two other fellowships. Our speaker today, Frankie Lyons, was awarded the Nathan and Sarah Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship for 2020. She is a PhD candidate in modern Eastern European history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. During the 2019-2020 academic year, she was a visiting researcher in Warsaw, Poland, at the Institute of Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences. Her research has been funded by Fulbright, as well as Title VIII fellowships. Her research in the JDC Archives has focused on the joint operation in Poland during the time of migration and political change from 1957 through the mid-1960s. The title of her lecture today is The JDC in Post-Stalinist Poland, 1957-1960s. Our format is that our guest speaker will talk for about 45 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are turned off. You can send us question via the Q&A function, and you can send us question at any time during Frankie Lyons' lecture. Frankie Lyons will now start her lecture.
Thank you for coming to my talk today. Much has been written about the JDC's role in aiding displaced persons in Europe after the Holocaust. The Joint was particularly active in Eastern Europe, aiding survivors and repatriates from the Soviet Union as they looked for family and emigrated abroad. The JDC was active in Poland until it was expelled from the country at the end of 1949. 8 years later, the JDC was invited to return to Poland in a moment of political change and crisis. In my talk today, I will discuss this lesser-known chapter of the JDC's history in Poland. I will examine the context of the JDC's return in 1957 by showcasing JDC archival materials. I will discuss their activities in Poland during this period, and then examine the JDC's complicated relationship to local actors and the Polish government. In the month after victory was declared in Europe, Fagel Himmelblau made her way from a concentration camp near Leipzig to her hometown in Poland. On June 9, 1945, a few days after her arrival, she journeyed a further 15 kilometers to a small neighboring village in order to settle issues of ownership regarding her pre-war property there. She was never seen alive again. Her body was discovered on the side of the road, and rumors circulated in surrounding villages that she had been, quote, terribly brutalized before the murder and tortured before her death. 3 days later, on June 12, 1945, another concentration camp survivor arrived in the city of Rzeszów. He encountered another man on the street and asked him if any Jews remained in town. The stranger replied, "There were before, but they've left now." The two men, both Jewish, began chatting before a police officer approached them and demanded their identity papers. The officer asked the men to follow him to a house where the town's ritual Jewish butcher lived. A crowd grew in front of the house as local police dragged the town's few remaining Jewish residents out of their homes and into the street. The violence quickly grew out of hand as civilians, police, and Polish army soldiers began to beat Jews in the street. According to one witness, the militia began to walk around the city and take every Jew with them and beat the Jews alongside the civilian population. While leading Jews through the streets, the crowd threw stones and shouted, "Beat the Jews." These events are known now as the Jesuit Pogrom. Exactly 2 months later, another pogrom happened in Krakow, leading to the death of one Jewish woman and the wounding of several others. The same would happen again in Kielce, almost 1 year later, where over 40 Jews were murdered. In the aftermath of this violence, particularly the Kielce pogrom, over half of the remaining Jews in Poland emigrated, reducing the Jewish population to about 100,000, mostly centered in Lower Silesia in the west of Poland. The JDC's activities in the aftermath of the pogrom focused on aiding repatriates from the Soviet Union and supporting emigration. These experiences, perhaps more than the Holocaust itself, led many Polish Jews and JDC actors to believe that Jewish life in Poland was not only undesirable, but unimaginable. In 1948, the Polish United Workers' Party came to power, beginning what we understand as the communist era in Poland. The period lasting from 1948 to the mid-1950s was characterized by Stalinism, which included close ties to the Soviet Union, intense state surveillance of civilians, and similar repressions. Beginning in April 1949, the Stalinist government began eliminating foreign welfare agencies from Poland. The Joint was one of the last to be pushed out, remaining until December 31st of that year. Samuel Jaffe, head of the JDC's Public Relations Division, described the process of the JDC leaving Poland in 1949. Quote, "The liquidation of the JDC office in Poland was, according to all records, a comparatively mild and uneventful affair," he wrote in 1957. "There were no charges made of any kind against the JDC by the government. There were no scathing attacks on JDC or its personnel. In fact, during the liquidation, the Yiddish press printed praise of the Joint and its activities. The only official announcement made by the government was the following, which I have here on the slide. In the first years after Poland attained its independence, the Polish government consented to JDC's activities, taking into consideration the exceptionally hard situation of the Jewish population, who suffered greatly during the enemy occupation. In view of the rehabilitation accomplishments and the integration of the Jewish masses into the effort to raise the economic standard of the country, and in view of the creation of new cultural centers, the particular type of aid of the JDC has become unnecessary. In connection with this, the Polish government took upon itself the full aid of its citizens of Jewish nationality. In October, a special conference took place with the representative of JDC, where it was stated that the activities heretofore by the JDC are not needed anymore in Poland. In that October meeting, then JDC overseas operations, then director in Poland, William Bein, was asked to liquidate the joint program in Poland. Quote, "At first it was agreed that all assets be turned over to a successor organization representing all phases and sections of Jewish life in Poland. Now this transfer was meant to be completed by December 31st, 1949. Quote, "As the days wore on and negotiations continued, this plan was whittled down further and further until finally a committee of 3 was appointed to take over the JDC assets in Poland. 2 representatives of the Central Committee of Polish Jews and 1 of the religious group. And this handing over would have consequences for the JDC's eventual return and the dynamic between the JDC and local leaders after 1957. In March 1953, Stalin died, leading to the end of Stalinism and political reforms in the Soviet Union. These reforms spread across the region, eventually leading to limited sociocultural liberalization during a period known as the Thaw. In Poland, this period saw the rise of Gomułka to power, an anti-Stalinist, reformist, and Polish nationalist who put the country on its own national road to socialism. That is, Poland remained close to the Soviet Union, but could develop its own approach or elements to state socialism. And for Jews in particular, the thaw led to two significant developments in terms of mobility. In 1956, Gomułka passed a law granting exit-only visas for emigration to Israel. This led half of Poland's remaining 100,000 Jews to leave Poland by the end of the decade. That same year, Polish and Soviet authorities negotiated terms for the so-called second repatriation, leading to the transfer of tens of thousands of people from the Soviet Union to Poland, including thousands of Jews. And it is within this context of complex political change, limited liberalization, and Jewish migration that the JDC returned to Poland in December 1957. In 1957, former JDC director William Bine wrote to then current director Charles Jordan about the organization's return to Poland. He wrote, "Your postcard from Krakow awoke in me thousands of memories. And I do want to thank you for your thoughtfulness in writing from the country where I spent 4 of the hardest years of my life, and where at the end of my assignment, I suffered like many of the Polish Jews who are subject to persecution by oppressors. Thinking back, I feel like a child who loves most a parent who loves most the child, which made him really suffer. I can only tell you that I read this historical news of the JDC's return with deep interest and never stopped admiring your quick understanding of the complicated picture in Poland. I'm sure you met many of the people with whom I worked, fought, and struggled. I never stopped admiring the Polish Jews for their vitality and their interest in communal problems." And in this statement, we can see the struggles of relief work in post-war Poland, grappling with oppression and violence. We can also see an admiration and respect for Polish Jews, in particular the community-centered approach. The JDC returned to Poland with many of the same priorities it had had under Bine before 1950. In his press release regarding the JDC's return, Director Jordan stated, "Our assigned task from the Jews of America is to help Jews in need, wherever they may be." And we can see here on this slide, this is from the press release, we can see that he says that they are sending a mission into the country to discuss the setting up of a social assistance program on behalf of the 9,000 to 10,000 Jews who are among the Polish nationals recently repatriated from the Soviet Union. We can thus see from this press release and various other documents from the JDC archives that the primary priority of the JDC in this period was to aid repatriates. At least, this was the priority that was publicized and emphasized. Yet internally, it seems that the priority was often to support emigration. This brought the JDC into conflict with the various Jewish groups in Poland, including the Sociocultural Association of Jews and other Polish Jewish leaders throughout the period of repatriation from 1957 to 1960, as local groups in Poland were more concerned with long-term conditions for Jews in Poland. I will discuss some of these tensions later. Once in Poland, many Jewish repatriates from the Soviet Union stayed in repatriation points, often community centers or similar. We can see here in this chart the average length of stay of repatriates in these points in 1957. About half of repatriates stayed longer than 3 months in these points. The other half either emigrated or settled in housing outside of the repatriation point. JDC activities intended to improve the lives of these repatriates until the moment of emigration. I would characterize the JDC's activities in this period as falling into two categories: repatriate aid and heritage preservation. Aid for repatriates included some of the following activities listed here: education, food, religious life, aid to children and the elderly. The JDC encouraged repatriates and the established Jewish community to work together through these activities and become civically engaged. So here I'm going to discuss some examples of their activities in Poland. Just as they were in the 1940s, the JDC was chiefly concerned with supporting Jewish children through orphanages, schools, food distribution, and other programs. So we can see here photos from Jewish schools and a canteen that fed children. The JDC also funded summer camps, which were particularly popular among among Jewish youth. Through ORT, the JDC provided courses for children and adults in math, science, and history. Many repatriates did not speak Polish or even Yiddish. Instead, many spoke Russian, and the JDC funded language programs for repatriates. The JDC funded canteens and food distribution to repatriation points and Jewish community centers. The JDC in particular provided kosher food and care packages to elderly repatriates and community members. They also funded care homes for the elderly. A good deal of JDC funds went to restoring cemeteries and, in conjunction with the religious congregation in Poland, synagogues. Notably, they funded the restoration of synagogues in Krakow's Jewish quarter. Additionally, the JDC supported and funded the erection of memorials at sites of atrocity and mourning in Poland. Notably, they were involved in the creation of a memorial at the site of former death camp Treblinka in the early 1960s. JDC-backed canteens and centers hosted religious services, bringing repatriates and the local community together. And here is a photo of a Hanukkah celebration in 1957. In conjunction with the restoration of synagogues, the JDC supported ongoing religious services offered by the Religious Union of the Mosaic Faith in Poland. Repatriates were more religious on average than local community members, and these services were largely attended by repatriates. ORT-run short-term training workshops helped repatriates learn trades like sewing and mechanics. Jewish businesses opened that were run by repatriates. For example, a bakery in Legnica, run by Jewish repatriates and specializing in Jewish baking, became very popular. And in this photo, this man, a graduate of an ORT workshop, worked as a cobbler in Lower Silesia. Although some graduates of JDC-funded programs settled longer term in Poland, most emigrated further. Because of the nature of Gomułka's visa law, which granted exit only to people going to Israel, most migrants left for Israel, at least officially. But many found ways around this, and increasingly, by the end of the decade, people were leaving for other countries as well. The JDC encouraged emigration, providing emigration grants to qualified applicants. By the end of the 1950s, almost every applicant received such a grant. In this section, I will argue that the JDC's various activities, which helped revitalize and mobilize various elements of Polish Jewish life and community, eventually led to profound conflict over the nature of Polish Jewry itself after the Holocaust. My intention is not to judge any group's vision of the Polish Jewish future, but rather to understand these varying approaches and personalities. This brief moment surrounding the thaw created space for these discussions to be possible. And eventually, by the end of this period, emigration and political repression would silence them again. During the thaw, there were several Jewish groups operating in the country besides the JDC. The JDC was the largest international Jewish group in Poland. ORT worked with the JDC to administer the educational and professional workshops and training. The Sociocultural Association of Jews in Poland, or what I will refer to in the rest of my talk as the Union, was the state-recognized Jewish association in Poland. The religious union of the Mosaic faith represented the Judaic religious community in Poland. When the JDC returned to Poland, they were not permitted to operate their own offices in the country or have a permanent representative. Instead, their activities were run through local union offices scattered throughout Poland. This, in part a legacy of the 1949 handover, brought the two groups into sustained contact and collaboration. The JDC provided funds to the religious congregation for religious items and services, and ORT and JDC worked to administer workshops for repatriates. In general, the JDC funded the activities I mentioned earlier, and these groups enacted them on the ground in Poland. Though these groups were united first in their desire to aid repatriates and restore Jewish heritage sites, they soon splintered. Tensions appeared in the very first meetings of the newly returned JDC and the Union. JDC Assistant General Director Samuel Haber noted that in the first weeks of the JDC's return, quote, "The matter of cooperatives was practically the sole matter on the agenda, leading to a heated and often acrimonious discussion. Union leaders who represented the Jewish community in Poland wanted to aid repatriates, as did the JDC, but they also wanted to establish Jewish workshop cooperatives that would employ Jews, repatriate and non-repatriate alike. The JDC was opposed to this." About this debate, Haber writes, "Despite the strong anti-cooperative stand I took at the meeting itself, I am very much ambivalent about this matter. I have seen these desperate people really trying to earn their bread instead of having it handed out to them. Co-op workers were attacking the union for not helping the co-ops enough. If these people are to remain here for a longer or shorter period of time, it is better for them to be usefully employed than to vegetate." However, 2 months earlier, before this meeting, then Israeli Foreign Minister Golda Meir expressed her concerns about the JDC's return, telling a JDC official that the organization should, quote, "not be under any illusion about what may be done for the Jews in Poland." She was concerned that Polish Jewish leaders wanted to prove that Jews can, quote, "live in comfort and security in that country," which for the JDC would be dangerous and most unfortunate. Meir was particularly distressed to hear that the JDC may get involved in cooperative workshops. And we can see this as a pro-Zionist approach that is encouraging not only emigration writ large, but specifically migration to Israel or Aliyah. This is true. Yet the JDC was concerned also with helping Jews migrate to countries besides Israel. I attribute the JDC's policies also to the legacy of the Holocaust and post-war violence that I discussed earlier. As Bein's comment about his work in Poland in the late 1940s demonstrated, the JDC's institutional memory of post-war violence remains strong. We can also point to anti-communist sentiment among the JDC officials. The JDC was not only a Jewish group, but an American one, and these influences and Cold War context created tension between the JDC and Polish Jewish communist leaders. A couple of months later, in February 1958, an internal JDC report restated the JDC's policy in Poland. Charles Jordan outlined the policy thus: "We came to Poland at the invitation of the Polish government to assist the repatriates, and the main wish of the repatriates is to emigrate, and it is for this reason that most of them came to Poland. As long as immigration goes on, the JDC cannot undertake any capital investments and start a large-scale program of productivity in Poland. We must restrict ourselves to relief work. If and when movement from Poland will stop, the situation may have to be reviewed." This sentiment is understandable, given the recent history of the Holocaust and post-war pogroms. What is more interesting, though, is the development of this tension between relief work and community building, between JDC perception that Jewish life in Poland is untenable and the union's desire to build a community under socialism. In November 1957, as the JDC geared up for their return, Director Jordan wrote to Raphael Levy at the United Jewish Appeal, saying, "The Polish Jewish communist leaders have a big chip on their shoulders. They think a fundraising campaign in the US for the benefit of Polish Jews would produce enormous sums and by rights belong to them." And we can see here the legacy again of the 1949 transfer of JDC assets and the complications of running the JDC through local offices that aren't run by the JDC. And Jordan concludes, "We will be doing the JDC program and the people who are in need of our help a disservice if we let this become a Jewish political football." JDC leaders tried to appease local Jewish leaders in their meetings by negotiating and compromising when they could. As Haber wrote in 1958, "Like it or not, the Cultural and Social Union is the official, governmentally recognized representative of the Jews in Poland today." Yet, it had already become a Jewish political football, at least according to the perception of JDC actors. In March 1958, then president of the union told the JDC that, quote, "His organization considers the first phase of our work to have been completed, that is, the relief and welfare aspects, and we should now turn to the creation of cooperatives." The JDC wished to continue its work in Poland, but leaders like Haber feared that these disagreements and broader political crises might end their work. Quote, "The question of the JDC's work in Poland hinges on the struggle between Gomułka and his opponents within the United Workers' Party. The overthrow of Gomułka might mean the end of the contact with the West, and of course then, the end of our work in the country." Politics had consequences for the union too. As the thaw ended in the late 1950s, the union lost its influence with the government due to emigration and rising political anti-Semitism, which increasingly equated Jews with Zionism. And indeed, the influence of the JDC in Poland was sometimes used as evidence of the Polish Jewish community's suspicious ties to Israel, the West, and foreign Jews. The Polish government reduced its funding to the union. One JDC official believed that the union was therefore pushing the JDC into this productivity project in order to increase revenue, machinery imports, and therefore their position vis-a-vis the government. And in many ways, this was true, as the union increasingly struggled to get non-JDC funding and social engagement in the aftermath of the thaw. So we can therefore see this in part as an attempt to become more independent of the JDC. By the end of their first year in Poland, both the JDC and the union had become entrenched in their positions, leading to further resentment. Union archival materials are less effusive than JDC ones due to the nature of communist bureaucracy, but their files demonstrate feelings of frustration toward the JDC and a sense that they felt that the JDC did not understand the realities of life in communist Poland. On the other hand, JDC officials increasingly saw local Polish Jewish leaders as ideologues. One JDC official wrote in December 1958 that, quote, the leaders of the union are using all cultural meetings as a means to carry their propaganda, which is that the Jews should stay and help build up socialist Poland. Haber wrote that despite the JDC's efforts to encourage repatriates to emigrate, the union wanted to, quote, keep them. So we can see a marked evolution in the JDC's language regarding the union and local Polish Jews. In this first quote, which I read earlier, from their first days in Poland, we can see Haber's attempts to understand the push for cooperatives. And in the second quote, 1 year later, we can see the effect of a year of arguments, frustrations, and negotiations. Haber wrote, I personally would not trust local Polish Jewish leadership as far as I could throw a 20-ton piece of steel. I must confess to you, however, for you are certainly right, there's no future for this miserable remnant in Poland, and it is a mitzvah every time we find it possible to take some of them out and give them a chance for a new life. That mistrust went both ways. Local leaders wanted to build a Jewish life in Poland. It wasn't simply about collecting money from American Jews. But we can clearly see both sides stereotyping each other, the backward communist Jews and the wealthy American Jews. The union, in my opinion, had a real vision for building a Jewish life in Poland that was based in socialism and in many cases was earnest. The JDC's vision was incompatible with that because of its emphasis on emigration, largely to Israel, but as the decade wore on, increasingly to other countries. Indeed, the JDC just wanted Jews to leave Poland, where to almost hardly mattered. Other tensions arose. A rabbi from Israel visited Poland in 1958, and he had a meeting with Haber. The rabbi told Haber he had performed 141 circumcisions in Poland with a waiting list of 471. He had to leave Poland, but he wanted to return under the JDC umbrella with JDC funding in order to continue his work in the community. Haber replied that this was impossible. The rabbi then went on to appeal for funds to establish a rabbinical school in Poland, and he mentioned that the matzo being prepared in Wrocław was not being baked completely in accordance with Jewish laws, but he wouldn't raise a fuss about it. The next morning after this chat, Haber received a call from a different rabbi, quote, threatening hell and damnation unless the JDC rushed in matzo to prevent the contamination of Polish Jews. Haber says, when I was able to get a word in edgewise, I told him that the JDC is not responsible for baking matzo. Tensions between the union and the religious congregation also increased during the early years of the new JDC period. All three groups had competing visions of the Polish Jewish community and its future. Haber wrote that the JDC's strategy of, quote, strengthening the religious union has resulted in the fact that they and not the union are attracting the Jews of Poland, and this the union cannot tolerate. They want to absorb them, or if that is impossible, they will destroy them. And though I believe this is a bit far-reaching, the union and the religious congregation did come into increasing conflict in this period over differing visions of the Polish Jewish community, that is secular and socialist versus religious. By 1959, both repatriation and emigration rates were slowing. The union made another strong push to the JDC about productivization and cooperatives. The president of the union wrote to Director Jordan in February 1959, saying that, quote, in analyzing the situation, moods, and wishes of various strata of Jews in Poland, we've reached the conclusion that for a certain number of Jews who, for various reasons, do not wish to work in cooperative workshops and are unable to create their own private enterprises, an opportunity should be made available for work in Jewish social workshops, that part all in caps. The decision was taken by the Polish government to allow such institutions that would employ Jewish workers so that the profits of these institutions would serve solely for Jewish social and cultural purposes. The union then went on to enumerate what they perceived as the benefits of that approach, which we can see here on this slide. And some of these would be that the cooperatives would employ Jews, the Jewish society would be the boss of these enterprises, they would receive tax reductions, and the money would stay within the Jewish community. So while the JDC's language about the union is understandable, again, in terms of the Cold War divide, the aftermath of violence, and just good old personality clashes. I would also characterize it in many cases as unfair. The union dealt with pressures from the Polish government, including budget cuts and growing political anti-Semitism after the thaw in the late 1950s and 60s. The Joint often interpreted the union's actions as greedy or foolish, but I see it as perhaps ideological earnestness or as a reflection of their lived experiences actually being in Poland through these political changes. And particularly as the union lost members and funding, they saw the cooperatives as a way to gain additional revenue outside of the JDC and the government. In June 1959, David Svard, one of the union leaders and manager of Yiddish Book, told Haber, "You are always saying welfare. We are always saying productivization." On the topic of repatriates, Svard said he did not care whether they stayed in Poland or emigrated. And he realized that the JDC considered them only to be in transit. But the time has come to end the period of them sitting on their suitcases. They should go to work, he said, and when they want to leave, let them go. In the aftermath of this conversation, in which union members became pushy, Haber claimed, "I fear that we must now take measures that may even involve our leaving Poland. The risk is there." Yet this period of flared tempers did not bring an end to the JDC's fight. The JDC's attitude can be summarized in this quote: "We shall perforce have to continue to work with the union, whether we like it or not, because they are the recognized and supported representative of the Jews in Poland." Though they did not get along, they had to work together, and work together they did to strong effect, as I believe I demonstrated in the photos of the JDC's activities in this period. As Poland entered the 1960s, the main priorities for the JDC and other Jewish groups shifted. The tide of repatriation and emigration slowed to a halt. The tensions and tempers of the 57 to 60 period quieted as the groups established a new normal for Polish Jewry. The JDC remained in Poland, compromising more and more on its earlier position and slowly supporting the establishment of Jewish cooperatives. However, due to the shrinking Jewish population, the union's vision of Jewish social workshops never quite came to fruition. And during the course of the 1960s, as more religious Jews left Poland and those sympathetic to socialism more so remained, the JDC lost influence and the union became the more prominent and important leader of Jewish life in Poland, although even it too lost its influence over the decade due to emigration. The Joint became entangled in Poland's growing anti-Semitism in the 1960s. In an internal Department of the Interior report from December 1965, the Polish government classified the JDC's activities thus: "Both Jordan and his associates from the Joint are of the opinion that sooner or later, Jews should leave Poland because the socialist system, even seemingly liberal, does not create conditions for the full development of the Jewish community and its national culture. The Joint's intrusion into the Jewish community in Poland greatly increases the emigration, pro-Israel, and Zionist moves in order to undermine the stabilization of the environment and inhibit the processes of integration and assimilation. Currently, the director of the Joint is connecting the JDC with different Zionist organizations, while at the same time emphasizing the American character of the group." And it became increasingly true in this period. The Jewish groups and individual Jews in Poland were being accused of Zionism. Even the supposedly anti-emigration members of the union were accused of this. And this conflation of Jews and Zionism grew in the 1960s, culminating in the 1968 anti-Semitic crisis. In March 1968, student protests against the communist regime were put down by the government, which accused protesters of being a Zionist fifth column in support of Israel in the Six-Day War. This anti-Semitic campaign, couched in anti-Zionist terms by the Polish government, saw the majority of Poland's remaining 50,000 Jews expelled from the country and stripped of their citizenship. The JDC left Poland again. In the end, the legacy of post-war violence continued, and the JDC's position that Polish Jews could not remain in Poland came true. But I want to push that it was not necessarily a foregone conclusion that the JDC would be right, that the Union's goal of building a Jewish socialism in Poland would fail. It was particularly not the case in the period of the thaw in the mid-1950s, when liberalization in Poland made so many more things seem possible to people in Poland. Indeed, the JDC's commitment to relief work was limiting, just as the Union's commitment to cooperatives was limiting. I want to return now, as I finish, to this quote about Bein's time in Poland in the late 40s. This sentiment, thinking back, I feel like a parent who loves most the child, which made him really suffer, could apply to JDC leaders again after 1957. Yet instead of applying this to the chaos of the post-war moment, it's how they felt about local Polish Jewish leaders. These arguments between the JDC and local groups were constantly in contention, born out of earnestness, fear, and hope for the future. These groups recognized this moment as a turning point, and though they ultimately had differing visions, they were able to come together in a moment of crisis, and in that way, leave their mark on Polish Jewish history. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Frankie, for a fascinating talk. I'm really happy you showed again that extraordinary quote at the end of your presentation, and I do see that we have a number of questions. So I will try to ask them in somewhat of a historical, chronological order, although we're probably going to have a few more coming in. So one question is, you mentioned that at the conclusion of the war, such Jews who were in Poland were predominantly in Silesia. Can you elaborate or speculate on the reasons for and significance of this, given that most of this territory was under German control before the war?
Great question. So that region, Lower Silesia, was a part of Germany before the war. After the war, the borders of Poland shifted west. So they lost the Kresy, or like the eastern borderlands, and they gained parts of Germany. And so there was an expulsion of ethnic Germans from that region. And what happened is that Jews that found themselves in Poland and repatriates from the Soviet Union often moved to these areas as they were being settled by the Polish government. So they were expelling Germans and resettling that region with Poles and with Jews too. And there were some towns in that region that had significant Jewish populations into the 50s and 60s.
And I see that we have a few questions about the repatriates. One question is, how many Jews left the USSR to Poland? And another one is, can you talk more about the Jews repatriated from the Soviet Union? Who were they? What were their circumstances? Was this due to the shift of the Polish border post-war?
Great. I could talk a lot about repatriates. I'm writing a whole chapter of my dissertation about this, so I'm going to try to keep it short. And if there are follow-up questions, I can address those. But the repatriates, so there were about 200,000 repatriates in this agreement that went from the Soviet Union to Poland from 1956 to the end of the decade, around 1959. Of those 200,000, about 10% were Jewish, so maybe 20,000. Different historians have different numbers, depending on the sources that they use. I say 20,000 Jewish repatriates in this few-year period. Who were the repatriates? Some of them were caught in the changing borders. So absolutely. And they found themselves now in the Soviet Union, and they kind of got trapped there after the borders were solidified in the years after the war. But then they later wanted to go back to Poland, which raises a question of what is a repatriate? Right, you're repatriating, you return to your homeland, your fatherland, but you've never been there before. So that's kind of an interesting phenomenon. Some of these people survived labor camps and deportations deep into the Soviet Union during the war. Some of them had stayed in the Soviet Union through the 50s because they believed in building socialism in the Soviet Union. Some of them got trapped there and wanted to leave earlier but couldn't. Some of them had family and couldn't figure out the logistics in time to leave in the first repatriation, which was in the 1940s.
So next question. Would you please explain in some detail what the cooperatives were that the Polish government, that Jewish leaders wanted the JDC to establish?
Okay. Yeah, so under communism, there were these cooperatives where people would work together and then the money would kind of stay in the community. And so the idea, what makes them different than, say, the courses that Ort was teaching, those were educational courses that were teaching mostly repatriates trades, right? So, you know, the cobbler, sewing, mechanics, there's certain types of engineering. These cooperatives would allow people who learn these trades to work in these cooperatives and pool the money together, right? And so it would stay in the community. And that was the idea. Instead of working for a non-Jewish cooperative, right, and having that money go outside of the Jewish community, the idea was that they wanted to have Jewish social workshops that would stay within the community.
So the next question, I'm going to mispronounce half of those words. So I'll try my best, and I apologize to you and to Zvi Gitterman who sent it. You focused appropriately on the JDC. What was the evolution of the TSKZ towards JDC? What was Hirsch Smoller's attitude? Have you read his memoirs? What did Fock-Stimme say regarding the JDC?
So in earlier drafts of this talk, I talked more about that, but because this is, as you say, appropriately the JDC lecture, I wanted to focus more on the JDC side. But it's a very interesting question. The documents aren't as colorful, I would say. I mean, you can see in this talk here, some people within the JDC were being a little bit flippant in their correspondence, which for a historian is great, right? Because they're being a little bit more casual and intimate. And the records of the Sociocultural Association of Jews are a little bit more bureaucratic. So it's hard to tease out some of that color. I have not read his memoir, but that's a great suggestion for me. I think his attitude, from what I can tell, I talked a little bit about how they're stereotyping each other. There was very much a sense that the JDC was coming in and taking credit for things, that they were being stingy with their money. And so you can see these tensions and stereotypes being, thrown back and forth. And I think a lot of that too had to do with the fact that JDC actors weren't really on the ground as much. And so a lot of their correspondence was once a year, twice a year, through letters. And what did the newspaper say? So he's asking the Yiddish language newspaper in Communist Poland, what did they have to say about the JDC? Very little. And this really upset the JDC. There are a lot of mentions in their internal memos of the JDC saying, again, we did this, but they didn't mention us at all. And that's because the Sociocultural Association of Jews wants to take credit and they don't want to talk about the joint. So in general, they're absent from a lot of the articles in the newspaper at the time.
Thank you. So we have a few more. We have a number of other questions. So interesting. Can you also talk more about how global Cold War tensions were playing into the JDC's work and its conflict with the Union?
Wow. Yeah, I can absolutely talk about that. That's a big question. I think there are definitely, communist and capitalist tensions going on, just even on an individual basis between these leaders. And you can see the way they're talking about each other. They're mirroring a lot of the broader stereotypes and tensions of the Cold War. That's absolutely true. Even though at the end of the day, they ostensibly had the same goal of helping Jews, and particularly repatriates, these Cold War tensions were hard to get rid of. I think that's especially true because of perceptions. After this anti-Jewish violence, after the Holocaust, but also after Stalinism and perceptions of the Eastern Bloc under Stalinism. And so this is also a moment where Eastern Europe is coming out of the repression of Stalinism and is kind of reevaluating what is acceptable liberalization under communism? How far can we take this, right? And eventually they can't take it very far. But what they do is develop these national roads to socialism, which I think, plays into this question about the global Cold War. And what happens is that all of these countries in this region start to develop like particularities to their brand of socialism, right? So like Poland halts collectivization, for example. And nationalism is now considered acceptable, if not, encouraged. So you have like Gomulka, who is a Polish nationalist and believes in, having like a Polish brand of socialism. And this occurs throughout the region at the time.
Is it possible to know to what degrees individual Jews felt affiliated, represented, involved by the organized communal structures? Were there unaffiliated Jews?
Yeah, there absolutely were unaffiliated Jews. And this is a tricky question to really answer from a historical perspective, because those unaffiliated Jews are not really represented in archives in the same way. So you can find, for example, what I tried to do to get at that perspective is look at, surveillance records of the Polish state and who they're tracking because they perceive them to be Jewish or having ties to foreign Jews, etc. But that's problematic as well, because then you're using the surveillance record to tell these stories. You can't really do that. You have to problematize that. There absolutely were unaffiliated Jews in the 50s, but they tended to either have less strong Jewish identities, so they didn't feel a compulsion to be in a group and associate with other Jews in that way, or there is another reason. But generally, they're not as represented in the materials.
And I see that we have two questions about the Treblinka Memorial. And they're similar questions. So basically, it's how involved was the JDC in the creation and planning of the Treblinka Memorial? Where could these records be found? I suppose we have things, I don't know if you've found some things in our archives about this, Frankie. Yes.
Yeah, so about the Treblinka Memorial. There's a lot in the JDC archives about the creation of this memorial. Now, I believe that it opened in 64, and I could be wrong on that, but I believe it was 64. So in the time period I'm looking at, I don't really go beyond 64. So what I was reading was really the build up to this. In general, the JDC was not involved in the planning of the memorial in the terms of like design. They were involved, they helped with funding. They were there at the unveiling, and they were in correspondence with the committee organized by the Polish government to create this. What's interesting about the creation of the Treblinka Memorial, so if you want to find records on this, you can go to the JDC archives online, which I want to plug because it's amazing. Their digitization is fantastic. And you can probably just search, the years that you're interested in and Treblinka, and you'll find a lot of the materials I'm talking about. What's interesting about this, this committee that was set up by the Polish government is that it was headed by a man, Stanisław Turski, who became the rector of the University of Warsaw during '68, and was responsible for expelling students and professors from the school. So it all kind of comes together.
Another question is, did the Jews tend to be Zionist, and did JDC teach Hebrew to prepare to go to Israel?
Oh boy.
That's a big question.
That's a really big question. Okay, so as I said in my lecture, I'm really trying not to judge any of these actors. And I know a lot of people hear this story and they take a side. I think it's just really interesting how they all, they were trying to come together, and there's fundamentally, had these differing opinions. Did the Jews tend to be Zionistic? I would say no. In general, no. The repatriates were in general, less educated. That's why there were these education programs set up, less literate. They did teach Hebrew for people to go to Israel and have Hebrew. So I would say that the JDC in general, was Zionistic in this period, but really their goal was not to encourage Aliyah to Israel. It was more so just to get Jews out of Poland. And it becomes really clear when you're reading these documents that they're just saying, wherever they want to go, we'll figure it out. We just need to get them out of Poland. So that's a tricky question, but I would say in general, no, but there absolutely was Zionism, right? So it's not entirely false, some of these accusations of Zionism. What becomes an issue is when these, supposedly anti-immigration members of the Sociocultural Association of Jews are accused of Zionism.
We have actually, I'll go back to the Treblinka question. It seems to fascinate people.
I understand, it's really interesting.
We have a follow-up question on that. Okay. So the question is, to my knowledge, the memorial in Eastern communist countries were mostly very focused on stories of communist opposition to fascism and didn't even include Jews. Was the Treblinka Memorial different in this way? So interesting that JDC was involved in the construction. So do you think that Treblinka was a bit different than other memorial?
Also a great question. So the thing, I guess it depends on what memorials you're talking about, because I think often people think of Auschwitz and commemoration at the site of Auschwitz when they're talking about memorialization of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. And the development of the memorial there was very different than the memorials that were set up at the former death camps of Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, all of this, right? A very different history, because in Auschwitz, there were survivors who set up the first exhibits there, right? And under Stalinism, those exhibits were exactly what you're saying. They were focused on, this grand, honorable fight against fascism, and national difference was sublimated to that message, absolutely. But the, Action Reinhard camps of Treblinka and Belzec and Sobibor, they did not have memorials set up until the 60s, really. And that's because during this period before that, there really wasn't a push to commemorate Jewish suffering. And so in the 60s, there is kind of this push to say, well, there should be a memorial there. So that would be why I would think the JDC was involved. And again, they weren't calling shots on the memorial at all, but they were up to date. They were in conversation with the committee that was calling the shots. And I think that it was a moment, again, in this context of like post-thaw and national road to socialism, talking about national differences.
So I see that we have questions a little bit more about your research in general. One question is, were you able to speak with people who participated in JDC-led activities in Poland during that time and get their perspective about the meaning of JDC work on an individual level?
I was not. It's people talk a lot about how we're losing Holocaust survivors and that memory is disappearing, but we're already at the point where this period is starting to slip away in terms of interviewing people. And so I found that there were a couple of people that I was almost put in contact with when I was doing my research in Poland, and then before the interview, it was this question of, are they able to do this like mentally? And I think if you know anybody, please put me in contact, because I would love that. But I kind of quickly gave up on doing that as a main form of my research for this project, unfortunately.
So this is a call to our participants. If you know people
yes.
that you can put in touch with Frankie Lyons, please write to the archive and we'll pass the message.
Thank you.
So we also have another question, again, about your research and your approach to it. Have you tried to cooperate with current TSKZ while collecting documents, whether and how this organization has changed since the 1950s?
Great question, Jan. I think, I was in contact with, the current organization about this, and really they just directed me to the Jewish Historical Institute. But to be fair, when I reached out, it was around the beginning of the pandemic, and it was kind of a tough time for everybody, and no one knew when they'd be able to work again, really. So I would love to do that again. And if you have any suggestions or connections to help me with that too, I would really appreciate that.
And we also have again a question: will you use the research in this lecture as part of a larger research project? And I mean, this is part of your thesis. So if you want to say maybe a word about your thesis,
Sure. So the question is, how does this fit in, right? Yeah, okay, so how I use this research in terms of my larger project. So this is a part of my dissertation. And my dissertation is examining perceptions of Jewish belonging in Poland in the context of the thaw. And so I want to take seriously that some Jews wanted to stay and build this community, like I was talking about today, but also some of the tensions that came with that. And so my first chapter is on post-war repatriation. I start with the pogroms and that first exodus of people out of Poland, and then I go up through 1960, which is what I consider the end of the second repatriation. And I'm also going to talk about the Gomułka Aliyah, so this emigration of Jews primarily to Israel. And then, the social organizations and their connections. And I'm also going to have a chapter on international actors, so like the JDC, but also there were festivals going on in this period because the thaw opened up this part of the world to the West. And so there were a lot of international festivals that were a little bit more open than they had been under Stalinism. So talking about that and the interactions between, for example, Jewish delegates to youth festivals and their connections to Polish Jews and the interactions that they had.
Sounds fascinating. When do you think you'll be?
Oh boy, I don't know if I want to say.
That's the question not to ask, really. Well, thank you, Frankie. Frankie, thank you for such an engaging lecture and for taking the time to answer all those questions. The next JDC Archives program will take place on June 10. We'll be screening a documentary film, Rescue in the Philippines. The screening will be followed by a Q&A session with the film's senior consultant, Barbara Sasser. You can register for the program via our JDC Archives Facebook page. And we hope that many of you again will be able to join us. Please sign up also for our e-newsletter if you would like to be added to our mailing list for public programs. And thank you to all of our participants for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.